Welcome to NC3T's Brown Bag Webinar Series. This is Hans Meeder from the National Center for College and Career Transitions, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. Today's webinar is entitled Pathways Policy Update. NC3T is a mission-driven organization focused on helping states, school districts, post-secondary education, and workforce partners develop college and career pathway systems. We provide technical assistance, coaching, and consulting services. We have some printed resources available. The first two can be purchased through the NC3T website under the Resources tab. Candace, I'm sorry to do this, but I am still only seeing your presentation mode. I'm not actually seeing the slides advance. I don't know what's wrong, but that's what I'm seeing through the, what are you seeing, Alisha?
I just still see the opening slide.
Right, so Candace, I don't think you're in presentation mode. Either that or we are, I don't know what's happening with, because we're not seeing your slides advance.
Okay, all right. Sorry for the technical problem here, folks. We'll see what we can do.
There we go. Go back one slide. So these are some printed resources available. The first two can be purchased through the NC3T website under the Resources tab, Employer Engagement Toolkit and the STEM Leadership Guide, and our newest book, The Power and Promise of Pathways, is due to be published this spring. We'll be offering pre-orders very soon. As we begin today's topic, I want to take a moment and remind our viewers about the Pathway System Framework. Advanced slide, please. Here you see 5 components of the framework. Cross-sector partnerships that create sustained collaboration among multiple stakeholders, well-organized career exploration and planning opportunities, multiple pathway programs of study at the secondary, adult, and post-secondary education levels, dynamic teaching and learning, which engages learners in rigorous and active learning using research-proven instructional practices, and employer and community engagement, offering work and learn experiences, employer-mentor relationships, and supports to help learners as they complete their programs of study and transition into employment or further education. A pathway system is not just another initiative, it's a way to bring alignment and focus to all of the work you do in education, training, and workforce development. The Pathway System Framework helps build sustainable cross-sector partnerships and develops a multi-pronged strategy for engaging learners to own their own education. So today's topic, at the local level, a college career pathway system is more than just career technical education or K-12 education reform or economic development and workforce development. It's a pathway system, when fully developed, involves the intersection and alignment of several strands of people, systems, and funding. So visionary leaders who are developing an integrated pathway system need to be familiar with several funding streams and their requirements. So that's why today we're going to provide an overview of several topics that impact local pathway systems: federal funding for education, the Federal Perkins Career Technical Education Act, which provides federal dollars for local schools and college CTE programs as well as state leadership activities, the new Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaces the previous version of K-12 education funding and requirements, and this law provides funding and accountability relating to school improvement, particularly for schools that serve large numbers of economically disadvantaged children. And finally, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and the Post-Secondary Education Act. As a follow-up to this webinar, we will provide each of you a link so that you can download today's slides. So we are very fortunate to have a well-qualified expert and a good friend, Alisha Hyslop. Alisha has spent over 15 years working with career technical education, and she is currently the Director of Public Policy for the Association of Career and Technical Education. Alisha leads the organization's legislative, advocacy, and research efforts that cover both secondary and post-secondary policy issues, and she's particularly involved in efforts related to the Perkins Act. Alisha previously worked with the Florida House of Representatives and with career technical student organizations at a state, local, and national level. She received her bachelor's degree from Florida State University, a master's degree from Virginia Tech University, and she is currently a doctoral candidate in career and workforce education at the University of South Florida. So again, as we turn over the presentation to Alisha, remember you can enter your questions in the question or chat box, and then I'll field those at the end of each section. I'll turn it over to you, Alisha. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hans, for the opportunity to share today, and to all of you who are on our webinar to get an update on what's going on in federal policy related to pathways and education and workforce development systems more broadly. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, and let me just stop, and Candace and Hans, did it advance like it was supposed to the next slide?
Yes, it did. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So as Hans mentioned, I work for the Association for Career and Technical Education, and just in case you aren't familiar with ACTE, we are an umbrella organization at the national level that represents the broad field of CTE stakeholders. Our members are primarily individuals at the state and local level. The largest portion of our membership is classroom teachers, but also administrators, business and industry partners, career guidance, counselors, some parents and students. The full spectrum of the CTE community is represented throughout our organization. We provide leadership and professional development, public relations activities around CTE, as well as work on federal policy and advocacy. And before I jump into the specific topics, I did just want to provide a little bit of information on the types of advocacy activities and policy activities that we engage in, just so you have some perspective on what we do and where we're coming from. Certainly, we engage in position development, and throughout the presentation, I'll work in just a little bit on where ACTE is coming from on some of these issues, although we're going to concentrate mainly on where Congress and the administration are. Direct lobbying, that's probably what most people envision when they envision policy and advocacy work, actually working with members of Congress directly on bills and legislation and regulations that impact CTE. But we also do a great deal of technical assistance to federal policymakers, helping to connect them to individuals in local communities that are on the ground implementing programs and have ideas or challenges that they're facing. We also work in a number of different coalitions to help spread the CTE message and hopefully make some of the connections at the federal level that many of you are trying to make at the state and local level. Resource development, fact sheets, tools, positions, background information. I know Hans mentioned that the PowerPoint slides would be readily available, but you can also visit our website, www.acteonline.org, and find a host of additional resources on any of these pieces of legislation if you're interested in learning more. And then finally, education and training for the field to help CTE stakeholders around the country understand and be able to best utilize federal policy, as well as to take an active role in the federal legislative process. And one of our marquee education events for the year is coming up in just a couple of weeks, our National Policy Seminar, where advocates come to Washington to learn more about federal policy and actually get involved in the process by visiting Capitol Hill. If that's something you're interested in, there is information available on our website. That event will be held February 29th through March 2nd, so coming up in just a couple of weeks. And later this fall, we wanted to highlight this event as an opportunity for you to plan towards late November, early December. We have our annual Career Tech Vision Conference, which will be held in Las Vegas this year. And we have a lot of exciting partnerships that we're growing and expanding. There's the merger with the Career Clusters Institute that happened last year and will continue to be expanded. Additional partnerships we're working on to make sure to provide all of the latest content and meet the needs of CTE stakeholders from around the country will be happening in this event. So registration for Vision opens in just a few weeks, and we hope many of you will join us at our conference this year. So with that kind of background and perspective, I wanted to jump into the first topic that we wanted to talk about today. And we've divided the presentation into 4 buckets of content on 4 different topics, as Hans outlined during his introduction. And we're going to stop after each one and take your questions. So if you have questions specific to the particular topics, we will answer them as we go, so that you don't have to wait until the very end to get your questions answered on these early topics. And the first thing we wanted to talk about was federal funding. And at the beginning of all of my presentations where I'm talking about funding, I like to show this pie chart just to give people an idea of what the federal budget actually looks like if you think of it as a whole. You know, often we talk about billions and trillions of dollars, and it's kind of hard to imagine how the pieces fit together. But I think this pie chart shows 2 things. One, it shows just how small the amount of education funding coming from the federal government is, how a piece of a pie it is. And it also demonstrates the impact of what we at the federal level call mandatory versus discretionary spending. Within the federal budget, there are 2 pots of money. The discretionary spending side is money that Congress appropriates each year through the budget and appropriations process. And that's what we tend to concentrate on, and what I'll actually talk most about today, because that's the money that Congress is able to move and reallocate and increase or cut through that budget process each year. On the other hand, the mandatory spending, which in the federal budget currently takes up about 60% of the dollars. It's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and that other mandatory spending pot, which includes a wide range of things, programs in the Farm Bill, some student loan programs, and a whole host of other activities, as well as interest on the federal debt. Those are dollar amounts that Congress does not allocate through the budget and appropriations process. Those dollars flow to the programs as long as people or grantees meet the eligibility requirements. Social Security is a great example. Whatever the current rules of the Social Security program are, those dollars flow out regardless of how much Congress wants to spend or doesn't want to spend in a particular year. The only way for federal policymakers to impact the amount of money going out through those mandatory programs is actually to go into the programs themselves and change the eligibility requirements. And that's a very difficult political task at hand. So we see just a very small percentage of the budget, defense at 19% and non-defense discretionary at the 16% plus the 2% for education that's pulled out in this chart. That makes up all of the debates in Washington about funding right now. So with that as the backdrop, I wanted to run through quickly the general process for federal funding. This is how it's supposed to work. Generally in February, President makes his budget request to Congress, and this is just the administration's suggestions of what should be funded and by how much. After that, Congress has to pass a budget resolution to set overall funding levels. Right now, those funding levels have to be within caps that were set a few years ago under the Budget Control Act when we first started dealing with sequestration and the threats of sequestration. Once the budget resolution and those caps have been approved, then the appropriations committees come into play. They set funding levels for each bill. There are 12 appropriations subcommittees in both the House and the Senate. Each one of those will get a specific pot of money that they're able to spend. The Appropriations Committee that is the most critical to Pathways programs is the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Committee. And that subcommittee in both the House and the Senate will write the individual funding bills and set individual program funding levels. That is supposed to occur each year by October 1st, which is the beginning of the federal fiscal year. But as you've seen in recent years, that is often not the case, and those funding bills are often delayed moving forward. That delay certainly came into play last year. The appropriations committees did work writing funding bills, but in the summer things really got bogged down because the spending caps that had been set in Congress last year were so low that politically those appropriations bills were not able to be passed. There just wasn't enough money in them to make enough members of Congress happy that they would be able to vote for those bills. So the process got bogged down, and Republican and Democratic negotiators got together again to look at the budget caps and figure out if there was a way to increase those budget caps and smooth a pathway forward for the appropriations bills. They were able to reach an agreement late in the fall to raise the discretionary funding caps on both the defense and the non-defense sides for FY16 and FY 2017, so this coming funding year. There were several more delays, as you can imagine, in Washington these days, but finally an omnibus appropriations bill was approved on December 16th. Due to the increase in the budget caps, overall funding for education was slightly increased, although there weren't significant increases to many programs. Within that, the Perkins Basic State Grant was level funded, as well as the National Programs line item, which was level funded, despite some cuts being proposed to those dollars earlier in the process. So that left us, when we came back in January.
Alisha, forgive me for 1 second. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're getting a little bit of distortion from your microphone, so maybe just pull back a tiny bit. Thanks.
Okay. Is this better?
Sounds better. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry about that. When we came back in January, that provided a clean slate. With the FY6 appropriations process done and the dollars set that would go to schools on July 1, we could start the process for the next fiscal year fresh, so to speak. And that process kicked off for fiscal year 2017, which, keep in mind, is the funding that will go to post-secondary institutions and local education agencies for the 2017-18 school year. So funding for next school year, 16-17, was set through that FY16 appropriations bill that was finalized in December. The funding that we're talking about now and will be talking about throughout this calendar year is for the 17-18 school year. So as I mentioned earlier, the first piece of that process is the administration's budget request to Congress, and that was released just last week on February 9th. Unfortunately, in the political climate that we're in right now, most of the budget is considered dead on arrival with Congress. In fact, the budget committees in both the House and the Senate have already said they're not even going to bring the administration in to testify on its budget request because they don't think the ideas are things that Congress would be interested in. Some of the individual appropriations committees will invite administration officials to testify, but we don't think many of these proposals have any chance of moving forward with Congress. However, it was good to see Perkins level funded. ESSA was also level funded in that budget. I think some advocates in particular had been hoping for an increase there because the law was just reauthorized. And then there was a small increase for WIOA programs in the President's proposal. As we look at the process moving forward, the budget caps agreed to in FY16 are going to be almost exactly the same in FY17. It was a 2-year budget deal, and really the budget caps weren't increased significantly at all. It's like $1 billion across discretionary spending, so not even 0.5% of an increase there. That means that it's going to be very difficult for some of the new programs the administration proposed, even if Congress wanted to implement those programs, and there's really not room within the budget caps. And we've also seen, since we came back in January, a lot of threats from House conservatives in particular, looking to cut funding even below the levels agreed to in the budget caps. A lot of calls to revisit that agreement and look at cutting funding even further. Just for full disclosure's sake, though, there were a number of proposals in the President's budget that would impact CTE programs and broader pathways programs and connect to the work that a lot of stakeholders in this arena are involved in. Some of them sound great. $4 billion to increase access to computer science programs, $3.5 billion to connect youth to summer and year-round jobs, money for apprenticeships, money for a new tax credit for community college and employer partnerships, reforms to the Pell Grant program that would help students access Pell Grants for short-term and part-time training. So a number of new proposals in the President's budget that sound great, but that, as I mentioned, really aren't practical, both from a political standpoint with the disagreements on spending levels, as well as from a practical standpoint with the budget caps that are currently in place under the agreement that was passed last year. So it will be a very interesting appropriations year, and the next thing we'll be looking for are those the budget resolutions to come out of the House and Senate to see whether they stick with the current caps or look to cut those even further, and then the appropriations bills moving forward. So I think with that,
Alisha, for the sake of time, since we're a little bit behind our schedule, it sounds like funding for federal education funding is going to be relatively level. So it sounds like the actual policy changes and flexibility that might be coming in some of the other pieces of legislation are probably pretty relevant to what people can do at the local level. So let's just move right ahead into the Perkins Act discussion, if you would.
Okay, that sounds great.
Thanks.
So Perkins Act reauthorization, this is probably the policy that in our office we get the most questions on and that we know CTE stakeholders are the most engaged in. And after about a year of not much activity, there has definitely been a flurry of interest and involvement by Congress over the last few months. I'm going to start with the Senate side and talk a little bit about their activities, and then we'll talk about what's happening in the House right now too. So first in the Senate, two members of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee are leading Senate efforts, and that's Senator Mike Enzi and Bob Casey from Wyoming and Pennsylvania, respectively. And these members are not the chair and ranking member of the Health Committee, but they play leadership roles on subcommittees, and particularly Senator Enzi was very active in Perkins Reauthorization back in 2006, and Senator Casey has a strong interest as well. So these members were in prime positions to take a leadership role and hope to move this forward. In late October, that committee, under those two members' leadership, announced 8 bipartisan principles to guide their work moving forward on Perkins. And I'll go through those on the next slide. Those principles are significant for 2 reasons. One is that they're bipartisan, and that means that even in this very contentious political climate, the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate have made a strong effort to come together and to work on CTE legislation in a bipartisan way. I also think the principles are significant because it shows the thoughtfulness at which the committee approached this process. You know, they started with some big ideas and then are moving forward from there. After those principles were released, the Senate requested detailed recommendations from groups and stakeholders and held listening sessions in early November. Since that time, they've been making outreach to constituents, asking additional questions of advocacy groups in Washington, and holding staff-level negotiations between the committee leadership about actual legislative language. We know they are working on a draft bill, and that draft bill could be released really any day now. The reports that we last heard were that they were hoping to release that draft in February, but no specific timetable has been released. What will happen after a draft is released is really uncertain as well. Generally speaking, the next step would be a committee markup of the bill. We already know it will be a bipartisan document, and so the level of support from other members of Congress and other stakeholders will probably determine how quickly it moves through the committee markup process, and then if it ultimately goes to the Senate floor. So just a quick look at the Senate priorities. I won't read them all, but you'll see as you read down the slide that they echo a lot of the concerns and priorities that many in our community have had for a number of years related to Perkins and CTE and pathway programs more broadly. Concerns about access to coursework, to equity, for more career guidance and counseling, more alignment between pieces of legislation at the federal level, ESEA and WIOA and Perkins, career pathways efforts in particular, as well as research and evaluation and innovation and best practices. So many of these themes are things that I think most everyone will look at and say, oh, yep, that'd be great. But the devil will certainly be in the details of how they write these into a piece of legislation. On the House side, there's not quite as much activity. However, the House did hold a hearing last fall. It was their first one in about 2 years. That hearing was held by the Education and the Workforce Subcommittee for Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education. And we were very pleased to have a great panel of CTE stakeholders represented, administrators from an area CTE center, from a community college, a business and industry representative, as well as someone who works on the research side directly with CTE programs. So it was great to have that local perspective for the panel to be able to share about all the great things that CTE is doing out around the country. A lot of the themes that came up in that hearing echo the themes we've been hearing from policymakers really on both sides of the aisle, in the House and the Senate. Business engagement, pathways, alignment, workforce alignment, making sure that CTE programs are connected to what students are doing next. And in that hearing, one of the things that Representative Rokita emphasized, just to kind of give you a nugget of perspective into his work, is that states need to be aligning high school and post-secondary coursework with the needs of the workforce, as well as this notion of many duplicative requirements, the federal role, so echoing some of the conversation we heard during ESSA reauthorization. ACTE's Perkins principles look very much like what we've seen out of the House and Senate, as I mentioned. One of the things that we're really digging into is more coordination within the law and less duplication between the different sections, as well as a focus on state and local flexibility to plan programs that meet their unique needs. So with that, I will stop and see if there are any quick questions on Perkins reauthorization.
2 questions to put to you, Alisha, thanks. The Senate had mentioned career pathways. Could you give a sense of how you think they define career pathways versus a more typical career technical education program?
Sure. I think that the staff working on the Senate bill right now are thinking of career pathways as they are defined in the new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act as kind of a broad definition, and our best guess is that they will be looking to use that definition in Perkins in some way, most likely to encourage or require, we're not sure which one, CTE programs funded under Perkins to connect or consult with or somehow be aligned to what's happening with career pathways under WIOA.
Okay, great. Another question would be, so the Perkins Act probably won't get finished or reauthorized this year. What happens to federal funding for CTE in absence of a new law?
Sure. So Perkins technically expired at the end of fiscal year 2012, so we're going on 3 years post authorization, and it really doesn't have much of an impact on programs on the ground. As long as Congress continues to appropriate funding, then the money will continue to flow. Requirements will stay in place just as they are under the current statute. And so even if the law doesn't get finished this year, that shouldn't impact funding or allocations for local programs.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks. Keep moving forward, and because we had those technical problems, we are a little bit behind schedule, so thanks for speeding up.
Sure. So the next area that we wanted to briefly touch on is the new Every Student Succeeds Act. As Hans mentioned, it was just signed into law in December. This is a picture of the bill signing ceremony that was long overdue. You know, the last question about Perkins Reauthorization, you know, we're only about 3 years late on Perkins Reauthorization. ESCA was about 8 years overdue for reauthorization when it finally got finished. And well, we won't even talk about WIOA, the next piece of legislation, and how long overdue it was. So many people had anxiously awaited the reauthorization of ESCA, and it is a very elaborate bill with a lot of moving pieces. So the fact that they were able to get it approved and kind of over the finish line in December of last year was a huge victory. It also bodes well for Perkins reauthorization getting done, you know, if not this year, certainly sometime in the near future, because Perkins is a much easier piece of legislation to reauthorize with a lot more bipartisan support. So since the federal legislative process has wrapped up on ESCA and we have a new law, the implementation process has really already begun, and everybody is shifting gears to focus on how we implement this new law. The Department of Ed has already issued some formal requests for information, dear colleague letters to states, working on the transition from the old law to the new law, and at this point there are still probably more questions than answers, but folks are beginning to prepare for what it will look like when we implement the Every Student Succeeds Act on the ground. Just a few highlights. Testing requirements and data disaggregation that were in the old law remain at the federal level. However, a lot of the other requirements of the old No Child Left Behind Act have been rolled back, providing more state and local flexibility. For example, the state still does have to intervene in low-performing schools, but the list of criteria are much smaller. High schools that graduate fewer than 2/3 of their students is one of the criteria that stayed in the law, though. The requirement that schools calculate their 4-year and extended year graduation rates is maintained. But outside of that, there's a great deal of state flexibility in designing accountability and intervention systems. And there are many new opportunities to include new accountability measures that weren't part of the systems under the prior legislation. There were a number of small programs consolidated under ESSA, and there's some new opportunities. Those programs were kind of rolled together and in some cases bundled into this new Student Support and Academic Enhancement Grants program under Title IV of ESSA, which doesn't get the most attention under the law, but does include a lot of provisions relevant to CTE and pathways, including a strong focus on career guidance and counseling. Specifically, in the new bill, there are a number of new CTE-related provisions. I mentioned the accountability systems already. The law also allows state report cards to include CTE student outcomes along with the academic outcomes of all students. The law designates CTE as part of a well-rounded education, which is a new definition that replaces the old definition of core academic subjects, just as a recognition that there are many subjects of value to students in their elementary and secondary education. New Title IV language around career guidance that I alluded to earlier. State academic standards, now it has to be included in the state plan how those standards are aligned with CTE standards. And also there are some uses of funds throughout kind of Title I and Title II, allowing for career counseling and work-based learning opportunities and academic and CTE integration. So not requirements necessarily under ESSA, but opportunities to use those robust funding streams to help strengthen, whole school efforts around increasing academic achievement, including CTE and for CTE students and professionals. So here's the timeline we're looking at for ESSA implementation. February 2016, which is now, they're forming a rulemaking panel at the Department of Education. That rulemaking panel will be active throughout the spring. We expect a public review of draft rules sometime this summer. Also, late spring, early summer, the Department of Ed is going to conduct a review of state assessment systems. July 1 of 2016 is when the statute said that formula changes required by ESSA would go into effect, kind of the new programs and then rolling things together and those types of things. However, the appropriations bill that was signed into law in December said, oh, well, we're not really going to put all those formula changes into effect in July. We're going to wait another year to do that. So some of them are going into effect in July, but most of the money will continue to flow for the next school year under the old law. August 1st is the expiration of all the current ESEA waivers and the requirements for adequate yearly progress. New competitive programs go into effect this fall. Hopefully regulations will be finalized late fall, all leading up to state plans for the new law likely being due next spring, so that everybody's ready for the entire law to be implemented for the 2017-18 school year. So really, the bottom line when we're thinking about ESSA is that for this coming school year, it will be a transition year. States should be using that to set up their data systems, to experiment, to set baseline data, to collect input and gather resources so that they can complete their state plan and then implement the new law in the 17-18 school year. So, any questions about ESEA?
Yeah, Alisha, and again, all audience members, if you'd like to enter a question, please do right now. I've got one kind of relating to the timing of the new state plans. When will states start to put together their plans for the new ESSA law?
So some states are starting right now, already working on state plan development. I think that will begin more in earnest once a little bit more guidance comes out of the Department of Education. There should be guidance on what has to be included in the state plan, a little bit beyond the detail that's included in the law. We don't have an exact timeline for that, but I think most states will be getting started soon because there's an extensive kind of public review period that those state plans have to go through, and then they'll be due to the Department of Education sometime next spring.
Okay. So it sounds like if people that are particularly interested in developing pathways work, they want to be involved as much as they can in helping shape those state plans, because it sounds like the states are given more flexibility than in the past.
Yes. State plans, particularly on the accountability side, if you want to see kind of pathways related indicators included in your state accountability system, that's a discussion that should be started right away. Local plans will play a big role too in how dollars are actually spent at the local level, and a lot of the things that are allowable uses of funds. If you want those to be a priority in your school district or institution, then getting involved in the local plan development, which will follow a similar timeline, will be important.
Great. Let's see, here's one quick question. ESSA relates only to the K through 12 world, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, good, thank you. All right, well, good. We just have a couple more minutes then to give a quick overview of WIOA, and then we'll finish up.
Sure, and we're a little bit further along in the WIOA implementation than in ESSA. So states have moved further in the state plan and local plan development process, but there is still room to get involved in this legislation as well. Just a few themes I'll emphasize. This law was signed into law in July 2014, so it's been over a year and a half since it was reauthorized, but it really emphasizes a streamlined workforce development system, better coordination within and across programs, something you keep hearing related to all of these pieces of legislation, improved outreach to disconnected youth, and greater value for employers in particular as we go through WIOA. Major changes in that bill required common planning across programs under that act, as well as common accountability measures, smaller and more responsive state and local workforce boards, a required implementation of industry or sector partnerships, as well as career pathway strategies, which relate a lot to the work that we all do. There was a shift in the funding so that more funding would be spent on out-of-school youth rather than in-school youth. But in addition to that, there's a 20% of youth funding required for work experiences. And then there were some changes to the one-stop infrastructure system and how the one-stop system across the country would be funded, which have some implications for post-secondary CTE partners. There are a number of opportunities for those primarily working in the education sector to connect to WIOA and the work that's happening, in the workforce development sector in many cases. The career pathways and sector partnerships are certainly prime opportunities. There's also new and expanded language on integrated education, the IBEST model out of Washington State, which allows adult basic education and technical education programs to be integrated seamlessly. There's opportunities for data sharing, for labor market alignment, for youth program connections to secondary CTE, as well as funding opportunities like the ability to offer contract training and other partnerships with post-secondary institutions. A question came up about career pathways earlier, and so I did just want to reference the new definition of career pathways that's included in WIOA. It's a more robust definition than is often used at the federal level that integrates both education, training, and support services. And this is the one that I think we'll see in some form in Perkins. And then we've also started to see in some Higher Education Act related bills. And just briefly, before we take the last couple of questions, I wanted to mention the Higher Education Act is also up for reauthorization and has some implications for pathways work, particularly around issues of post-secondary affordability, access, and quality. And there are a number of financial aid reforms that are under discussion, as well as issues related to data systems that may have some implications. The timeline for this reauthorization is not imminent, so there's plenty of time to kind of weigh in and work on ideas related to HEA. So I know we're just about out of time. I don't know if there's any final questions as we close.
One question just to put to you, Alisha, would be with that shift in funding with the WIOA from out-of-school youth to more of it, I guess, being for out-of-school than in-school youth, how is that going to impact the ability of pathway-type programs to coordinate with WIOA?
Well, I think it will make it more difficult to collaborate between local education agencies serving primarily in-school youth and the WIOA system. But what I've tried to emphasize to people, around the country as we've worked on this law is that there is still 25% of the youth dollars that can be used to serve in-school youth. So for connecting services, for additional resources, for populations that qualify for WIOA that are in school, it's not all of the dollars that have to go to out of school. There are still 25% of the dollars left. And then also the definition of an out-of-school youth is only applicable at the point of enrollment in WIOA. So we know many school districts run alternative education programs or dropout recovery programs, connecting pathways to youth that have been out of the education system, and most of those students would still qualify under the out-of-school youth definition under WIOA. So there's some flexibility there to kind of work within the system.
Great. Well, thank you very much. You've given us a really thorough overview of what's going on at the federal level, so thank you. We'd like to thank everyone who enjoyed for participating in today's session. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'd encourage you to join us in upcoming webinars. Our next webinar will be Program of Study Spotlight on Aviation Programs, March 16th from 1 to 1:45. So you can register at our homepage. We'll also be sending you a link to register in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out. Also, just to be clear, we will send in that follow-up email, send a link where you can download today's presentation and also information about the recorded version of today's webinar. So we'd like to keep improving our webinars. We'd appreciate your feedback on today's session. So at the end of the session, if you would, please fill out a brief 7-question survey that you will receive. Thank you again, everyone, for your time today. Hope you have a good afternoon.